Did Mary give birth to God? This question is central to the debate surrounding the heresy of Nestorianism. It is, of course, named after Nestorius, who was a bishop that argued that Mary only gave birth to Christ in his human nature. He argued against the term Theotokos, meaning God-bearer, and argued for Christotokos, meaning Christ-bearer, since she gave birth to Christ and not to God. He was not attempting to say that Christ is not divine. Rather, he was trying to say that God would not be limited to an infantile form born of a woman. The issue is, this separates the divine nature of Christ from the human nature, meaning that only one would act at a time, and they would act as independent persons. This becomes a problem when it comes to the crucifixion. If Jesus' human nature was the only one acting at that time, then there is no true impact, because humans suffer all the time, but he would not have been a blameless sacrifice for all of humanity. Babies, tragically, have been sacrificed for all of human history, even through today. But none of them have fulfilled Philippians 2, and therefore their sacrifice does not have the divine power that Christ's did. Were he only God, then he would not have been able to die, for death is not a part of God's nature. Therefore, both the human and the divine nature had to be present in the crucifixion, and both had to suffer the weight of sin. But let's think about Nestorius' logic for just a moment. God, according to him, could not be in an infant 2 or 3 months old, but he could dwell in a man in his 30s. Is a man in his 30s any more human than an infant? Of course not. Yet Nestorius affirmed the man and not the infant. This led to the Council of Ephesus, which we have talked about here on the channel, where Cyril, a bishop of Alexandria, debated Nestorius. Their positions actually somewhat bordered on 2 heresies. Cyril edged on the side of Monophysitism, and Nestorius debated a nearly heretical version of modern-day Diophysitism. For those unaware, these terms refer to the interaction of the nature of Christ. Monophysitism is a heresy as determined at the Council of Chalcedon, which states that the human nature of Christ was absorbed into the divine nature of Christ. This is problematic as we arrive at the same issue we do with Nestorianism, namely, the death of the divine nature. Death cannot be a part of the divine nature, since God is the author of life. Thus, Monophysitism is heretical. This is similar to the non-heretical Miaphysitism, which states that the human nature and the divine nature both exist in the one nature of Christ. Miaphysitism affirms only one nature of Christ, but both are present and actually make up the nature of Christ. This is different from Monophysitism in that the human nature is not absorbed and overshadowed by the divine nature, which is what Monophysitism says, but rather the divine nature and the human nature become one. The Eastern Orthodox Church does condemn Miaphysitism as heretical, but no other church does. So, then the opposite view is Diophysitism, which states that Christ's human nature and divine nature remain separate in one person. This would mean that each nature is responsible for actions that Christ does, and both partake in several actions. For example, when Christ needs to eat, that is the human nature acting. However, when he walks on water, that would be the divine nature acting. They are not separate, but they are acting separately, similar to how people might function towards one purpose, and in that sense are one, but they may have different actions in said purpose. This is not separating persons, rather it is separating actions and agency, which is important. Agency and personhood are closely related, but are not the exact same thing. We can use agency to talk about personhood. However, it is important to know that one person may have several agencies. So, as we mentioned, when Christ is experiencing physical stimuli, that's more so the human nature acting. However, when he does things like walking on water, which is a miraculous event, and as we have discussed many times on the channel before, a divine event, that would be the divine nature acting. It is still the same person doing both, just acting differently according to the natures that are present in him. And when Christ teaches, and more importantly, when he is crucified, both the human nature and the divine nature are present and acting. They are acting different in agency, but not in person. Both are acting in one person toward the common goal of redemption. However, the way that they get there is different. Their agency is different. How the natures act is different. But the person remains the same. I know this is really complicated and difficult to understand, but we got to work through it. The issue that Nestorius had was that he took Diophysitism too far. And in saying that not only did Christ have two natures, but the issue of the Theotokos meant that Christ had two persons, he confessed heresy. This is heresy because it would make Christ only fully God when the divine nature was acting, and not continuing to be fully God when the human nature was acting, because we have the divine nature acting as a divine person and the human nature acting as a human person, rather than Christ in one person acting both through the divine nature and through the human nature in given moments. As a result of this, Christ could not have been fully God at all times, which is a violation of Colossians 2:9 and thus is heresy. So, why is this important? Well, it helps us first and foremost to understand the nature of the incarnate God and who he is. By thinking through these difficult and complex topics, we can better understand exactly what God gave up when he took on flesh for us and suffered more than any of us have ever suffered. Most importantly, he rose again to give us new life. The human nature rose and the divine nature gave us life. That is something we must